at least temporarily, craving and ill will, and then one takes up the practice of satipatthana. And so then they say that the way to put away covetousness and grief is through developing at least the first jhana. So this means that first one develops jhana, and then one practices the 4 satipatthanas as the means for gaining insight. And so on this interpretation, first one has to achieve at least the first jhana, and then one starts to practice the 4 satipatthanas. But on the dominant interpretation, one could start off just as, a well-intentioned ordinary person without any special attainments in meditation. And then as one is developing satipatthana, one is removing covetousness and grief, or covetousness or craving and ill will. So in this way, it will be the practice of satipatthana that can be the means for developing the jhanas, or the means for going directly into into the development of insight. And so we have these 2 different interpretations right now, even amongst the followers of Theravada Buddhism. One is the predominant interpretation, but the other has become very influential through the teachings of the recorded teachings and maybe YouTube videos of a certain well-known Buddhist monk, not myself. I don't mention names. Okay, so that's one kind of disagreement. Then another kind of disagreement, actually, agreement about the phrasing, but about the meaning. Actually, this is a very important difference that one finds in understanding the way one practices the 37, all of the 37 aids to enlightenment themselves. This is a difference. There's a general agreement, I would say, within the Theravada school about how to practice, but I've seen an explanation of how to practice the 37, maybe in some commentaries I've seen it coming from within, amongst Tibetan Buddhists, but I think they're basing themselves maybe on the way it's expressed in one of the other early Indian schools of Buddhism. Okay, within the Theravada school, it's understood that the 7 groups more or less are laying out pretty much the same groups of factors. Maybe certain factors are more emphasized in some of the groups than in others. And so, for example, when one is taking up the practice of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, one also takes up the practice of the 4 right efforts. Then as one is practicing the 4 kinds of mindfulness and the 4 right efforts, one is also developing simultaneously some of the 5 faculties, some of the factors of enlightenment, some of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So if one is practicing, say, the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 4 right efforts, one is also practicing simultaneously some of the 4 bases of spiritual power, some of the 4 faculties, some of the 4 powers, some of the 7 enlightenment factors, some of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. But another interpretation that I've seen perhaps coming from another early Indian Buddhist school, perhaps it was the Sarvastivadins, I'm not sure, but they say that first one practices the four foundations of mindfulness, then when one gets them sort of well developed, then one moves on to the four right efforts. Then when one gains some degree of mastery over the four right efforts, then one goes on to the four spiritual faculties. When one gets the four spiritual faculties well developed, then one goes on to the four powers. Then when one gets the four powers well developed, then one goes on to the 7 factors of enlightenment. Then when one masters the 7 factors of enlightenment, then one goes on to the Noble Eightfold Path. But that seems to me, my own personal perspective, there's an agreement here as to the wording, to the phrasing, Bhyanjana, there's agreement, but the interpretation differs. One school, the Theravada school, says that one can be developing these 7 groups, at least certain factors amongst them, simultaneously. Whereas the other groups, the other school says that one has to develop the different groups in sequence. And now it seems to me that the view that one has to develop them in sequence, I have to say very frankly, it seems to me to be wrong. Because if one looks at the 7 groups, what is the basis for that particular pattern or structure, moving from the 4 foundations of mindfulness to the Noble Eightfold Path? What is it that sort of governs this particular sequence? What would you say? Asma?
Mindfulness and concentration, right?
Maybe I'm not getting the answer, the question posed precisely enough. Why are they arranged in this particular sequence? I think that's no. The 7 groups, why are they arranged? Right, okay, very good. It's simply arranged according to a numerical sequence. So first we have the 4s, 3 groups of 4s, then we have 2 sets of 5s, then we have a 7, then we have an 8. And then if you look in the suttas, how is the path factor, the Noble Eightfold Path factor of right mindfulness explained? Let's take the path factor of right effort. It's explained simply as the 4 right efforts. Then how is the factor of right mindfulness explained? Simply by the formula for the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And so the way that's explained in the suttas, it seems that the 7 groups are not laid out by way of a temporal progression from the 4 foundations of mindfulness to the Noble Eightfold Path, but rather simply by way of number. And maybe on some occasions the Buddha will teach the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Other occasions he'll teach the 5 faculties. Other occasions the Noble Eightfold Path. And it's just maybe the Buddha teaches in different ways because different people respond to different ways of presenting the teaching. Okay, now we come to the 3rd type of disagreement. Okay, here we have the case, and this is a very interesting one, where the monks disagree about, the monks agree about the meaning, but they differ about the phrasing. Okay, then in this case, the Buddha says, whichever monk you think is the more reasonable should be approached and addressed thus. The Venerable Ones agree about the meaning but differ about the phrasing. The Venerable Ones should know that it is for this reason, that there is agreement about the meaning but difference about the phrasing. But the phrasing is a mere trifle. Let the Venerable Ones not fall into a dispute over a mere trifle. So you see, the Buddha isn't so concerned about precision, exactitude in the phrasing, but it's the meaning or substance that's important. And to take a case where there was a difference about the phrasing but agreement about the meaning, it's the way the second group came to be expressed in different Buddha schools. Now, within the Theravada school, which is based on using the language that we now call Pali, the second group is called the four Samapadanas. Okay, so it's from this, the use of the word padana by the Buddha, you could see that the Buddha uses it to mean striving, effort, application of energy. But it seems over several generations that the word padana changed its meaning so that it came to mean the sense of primary or substance. And so maybe the later generations of Buddhists, especially when Sanskrit came to be the dominant language amongst the Buddhist community, might have been puzzling over the four pradanas, which would have meant to them the four substances or the four primaries. And so they were wondering, how could this be the four primaries? And so what happened in the Sanskrit tradition is that the word pradana got replaced by the word pahana, or in Sanskrit prahana, which means abandoning. Because one of the four padanas is about abandoning unwholesome states. So for that school, or the schools that use Sanskrit, the word padana was given up, but the word pahana, and it was replaced with the word pahana. And so they called it the four pahanas, which means the four abandonings. So I think when you have it in Chinese, what do you call that in Chinese? The four...
四正断.
Duan, yeah. Four zheng duan. The word duan means abandoning. And I think in the translation into Tibetan also they use the Tibetan word for abandoning. But as far as the definition goes, they were in agreement. So here, if there's a dispute between the followers of the Pali school saying it should be the four pahanas, others say the four padanas, the followers of the Sanskrit school say the four pahanas, but they shouldn't fight over this because they're in agreement with the definition, and it's the definition which is the meaning or the substance that's important. Okay, so that is the third case. The fourth case is where there is agreement about the meaning and the phrasing. I don't know why this case should actually be brought up, since if there's agreement about the meaning and the phrasing, I don't see any ground for a dispute at all. So I don't even see why there's a necessity to speak to monks on either sides and to caution them about falling into a dispute. Anybody have any idea how there could be a dispute if there's agreement about the meaning and the phrasing? Maybe a dispute about some other matter that has no relation to the interpretation of the Dhamma. Okay, let's move on to the next section. And the next section has maybe an application beyond the particular, Buddhist community, and it's quite useful advice for settling, for dealing with misbehavior in any kind of community of people. Okay, so here we have the case where the monks are training in concord with mutual appreciation, without disputing, and then some monk might commit an offense or a transgression. That is, some transgression of the rules of discipline, and so the need arises to speak to him. And so before the monk speaks to him in order to reproach him, then one has to consider the person in this way. So this is the way one reflects before rebuking the misbehaving person. Okay, one thinks, I shall not be troubled. There are actually 4 considerations here. First consideration, I shall not be troubled. Because one has to take one's own situation into account. And the other person will not be hurt, for the other person is not given to anger and resentment. Okay, the other person, okay, that's the second one. The second consideration, that the other person won't be hurt. The third consideration is that the other person is not firmly attached to his own view and he relinquishes easily. So if you reproach the other person won't be hurt, and he's the type of person who could easily relinquish his view and change his behavior. And then the fourth consideration is that I can make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish him in the wholesome. Okay, if we can bring together all of these 4 factors, these 4 considerations, then you should speak to that person. So this is the ideal situation. No trouble for myself, no trouble for the other person relinquishes his view easily, and I can transform that person's behavior. Okay, now we come to the second situation. Okay, in this case, I won't be troubled, but the other person will be hurt. The other person is somewhat sensitive, and he's given to anger and resentment. But, though he's a person who gets angry maybe quickly, provoked a little bit easily, but he's the kind of person who can reflect if you present him good reasons for changing his behavior. So he's not attached to his view, and he'll give up his view easily. So he won't try to defend, though he gets angry, but he won't try to defend himself and to argue and to, promote his own cause. And so in this way, one could make that person give up the unwholesome and adopt the wholesome. So in this case, Buddha says, it's a mere trifle that the other person will be hurt, even though one doesn't like to hurt the other person, but it's a much more important thing that one can convince that person to change his behavior, to give up the unwholesome, and to establish himself in the wholesome. So in this case, it's also the right thing is to speak to that person. Actually, if the other person is hurt, normally one would be somewhat troubled oneself, because one has to face the anger of the other person. But suppose that I have enough control, mastery of my own mind, enough strong compassion for the other person and well-developed equanimity. Maybe then if the other person gets angry and sort of snaps at me, I can take it and just reason with that person and convince him to give up his misbehavior. Okay, the third case. Okay, I will be troubled because I have to give up my peace and quiet in order to speak to that person. Okay, the other person won't be hurt, for he's not given to anger and resentment. But the third factor is that he's firmly attached to his view and he relinquishes with difficulty. Okay, maybe this is the kind of person who doesn't get angry, but still he's the kind of person who calmly argues back and tries to defend himself and to justify his misbehavior. Okay, but we have now the fourth consideration here is that I can make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish himself in the wholesome. So again, the Buddha says, it's a mere trifle in this case that I shall be troubled. But it's a much more important thing that I can make this person emerge from the unwholesome and establish him in the wholesome. So taking all of these four factors into account, then I should speak to that person. Okay, now we come to the third situation. Okay, when I'm contemplating speaking to the person, I reflect that I shall be troubled. Maybe I get upset easily, and I have to give up my peace and quiet to reproach the other person. The other person will be hurt, and he might get angry and snap back at me. And he's firmly attached to his view, and he'll argue and try to defend himself and convince me that he's doing what is right. So we have 3 counts against it, 3 reasons for just keeping quiet. But I realize that I can make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish himself in the wholesome. So even though there are 3 counts against it, but if I really persist, I can make that person change his way and adopt the wholesome. So in this case, again, the Buddha says, it's a mere trifle that I shall be troubled and the other person will be hurt and get angry. But it's a much greater thing that I can make that person change from the unwholesome to the wholesome. And so in this case too, even with so much in favor of just keeping silent, but the fact that ultimately I can prevail and transform the other person if I only speak to him and persist. So with that, taking account of that, then I should speak to that person. But then we have the fourth situation. Okay, here the Buddha says, okay, when one reflects on the situation, one realizes, I shall be troubled and the other person will be hurt and get angry. So we have two counts against speaking. Then the other person is firmly attached to his view and gives it up with difficulty. So a third consideration against it. And I cannot make that person emerge from the unwholesome and establish him in the wholesome. So now we have 4 counts against it. And so to speak to him, to reproach him, is just going to create trouble for myself, trouble for the other. And I'm pretty sure that, or maybe absolutely sure, maybe I and others have tried speaking to that person, and he just won't change his way. And so in this case, the Buddha says, it's kind of understatement, or maybe it's a very soft and subtle way, he says, one should not underrate equanimity towards such a person. Which means that one should just develop equanimity towards that person. But actually in other suttas, the Buddha says that if there's a person like this who really keeps on persisting in what's wrong, keeps on making trouble and difficulty for everybody else, and insists that he's right, what the Buddha says is that you should impose capital punishment on that person. And what is meant by capital punishment in the Buddha's teaching? What is capital punishment? You send them to the gas chamber. What is it? You remember Mahaparinibbana Sutta? Ananda asked the Buddha, what should we do with such and such a monk?
You ostracize that person.
In a way that sort of gets the point, but there's an exact expression that the Buddha uses.
Just silently and leave him alone?
Yeah, the Buddha says that you maintain silence to that person. It means that you don't give him any instruction, don't give him any guidance, and just let him, carry on. And then eventually, the sort of hope is that when he sees that all of the other monks are just treating him, giving him the silent treatment, which doesn't mean that you don't speak any words at all to him. Like if he asks, where are we supposed to go for our meal today, you could give him an answer to that question, on little practical matters. But when it comes to matters of giving any kind of Dhamma explanation, you just treat him with complete silence. Even the Buddha used that method sometimes with some disciples. And sometimes there's still another method that one has to use with a monk who creates a lot of trouble in the monastery. And what is that method? This is when all of the monks get together. Very close. You don't unless he actually breaks one of the fundamental rules, you don't kick out of the Sangha, but you kick out of the monastery. You say, go find another place to live. Then if he really mends his ways, then you could let him stay. But if he just keeps on arguing, then you have to insist to go. Okay, so this is the ways of settling, well, this is a way of dealing with a recalcitrant, troublemaking monk in the monastery. Okay, so first issue in the sutta are disputes within the Sangha, either about the meaning or about the phrasing. The second big issue is about dealing with a monk who is persistently committing transgressions. Now third comes about how to deal with what's called verbal friction that might arise. Okay, so the Buddha says, when you are training in concord with mutual appreciation without disputes, there might arise between you verbal friction, insolence in views, that is maybe obstinacy in maintaining views, then annoyance, bitterness, and dejection. How does one deal with this kind of problem? This would be kinds of disputes that arise not based about the Dhamma, but maybe about personal issues. Maybe one monk has a habit of behaving in a certain way, and so then he has his group of friends who like his way of behaving, other group doesn't like the way he's behaving. And so over some trifling matter, some conflict and dispute and even verbal friction arises. So how does one settle this? So the Buddha says, whichever monk you think is the most reasonable on one side, you go to him and say, well, we are training in concord like this kind of conflict and quarrel and disputes have arisen. Then one raises the question, if the recluse, here the word used is samana, probably it's obvious from the context it's referring to the Buddha. It seems strange that they're using the recluse. Why don't they use the word bhagava? That would make more sense to me, the Blessed One, or Tathagata. If the Blessed One knew, would he censor that? And so answering this rightly, the monk on the other side would say, certainly if the Blessed One knew about this, he would censor it. The Buddha would criticize them for disputing about such a trifling matter. Okay, then they go to the other side and they speak to the monk on the other side who's most reasonable, and they say that if the recluse or the bhagava, if he knew about this, would he criticize us for fighting over this trifling matter? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped the second question. So then they ask the monk on the first side, without abandoning that thing, can one realize Nibbana? In other words, while all of the monks are fighting and disputing, can they achieve the ultimate goal? You know, because all of them will have bitterness in the mind over this trifling conflict. And so unless they become reconciled with one another and become harmonious and are able to return to the state of training in harmony together, then that bitterness in the mind will always be an obstacle, and so they won't be able to practice successfully. And so answering rightly, the monk on the first side will say, without abandoning that thing, you know, that resentment and bitterness over their disagreement, then we cannot realize Nibbana. Okay, and then they go to the most reasonable monk on the other side, and they ask the same questions, and he'll answer in the same way. And then presumably, once they convince the leading monk on each of the two sides that the Buddha would have reproached them for arguing, and that without getting over this conflict, they won't be able to progress on the way to Nibbana, then the two sides will become reconciled. Okay, now comes the last part of the sutta, and that is how the monk who's serving as the, what they call this, the arbiter, the one who brings conflicting sides together, how he should respond if questioned about his role. So if others come to him and say, was it you who made those monks emerge from the unwholesome and establish them in the wholesome? Okay, answering rightly, should he say that, yes, I was the one who did that. You should all be grateful to me for playing such an important role in the Sangha, and you should make me maybe the chief monk in the Sangha. Is that the way he should respond? Or should he say it was due to my wisdom, my skill in negotiations that brought the two sides together? No. But the way he should answer should be, here I went to the Blessed One, and the Blessed One taught me the Dhamma. The commentary says that Buddha taught me the Dhamma. That is, the Buddha explained how to settle disputes or how to speak to a monk who has been misbehaving and to correct his ways so that he'll behave in the right way. So the Buddha taught me the Dhamma. Then when I learned this principle, then I spoke to the monks. And when the monks heard what I taught them based on the Buddha's teaching, then they emerged from the unwholesome and were established in the wholesome. A long time. Who's doing that? Okay, I think they're finished now. Okay, so then the Buddha concludes and says, answering thus, this monk neither exalts himself. He doesn't exalt himself by saying, I was the one who did that. I'm so wonderful, I'm so wise, I'm so clever. And he doesn't disparage others. So he doesn't say, oh, those monks were making so much trouble. Oh, they were so difficult to deal with. Oh, they were just so obstinate, but I brought them together anyway. And in this way, he answers in accordance with the Dhamma in such a way that nothing that he said provides a ground for criticizing him. Okay, so that is the end of the sutta. And I didn't really leave time for questions. But if there's a few questions, we could field them now and then leave the other questions for after lunch. Any questions? Okay, Barbara. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I have a big question.
A big question.
In the first section, I don't quite see how having it pointed out that there's something has not been grasped correctly changes
that something has not been. That something has not been
grasped.
Grasped. Yeah.
Yeah, hasn't been grasped.
Yeah.
How does that change the mind of the person who hasn't grasped it correctly?
Yeah, that's why I raised the question too. I didn't quite get that.
Because most people, I think, would respond, no, my understanding is correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe if you found out first and then you would say,
Yeah, I think, anyway, I think that question will be settled in the next sutta that we're going to take in 2 weeks. I remember that was dealt with in Lavinia, dealing with disputes like that. Basically, what one has to do is choose a very learned monk, or it could be even like a committee of very learned monks who everyone regards as being sort of trustworthy and reliable in their grasp both of the wording of the text and their interpretation of the meaning. And one goes to either that one or that group to settle the dispute. Okay, Richard, first take the microphone.
What strikes me is that there is no moment in these instructions where the person who is settling the dispute asks himself whether he might be wrong. It does not occur. That is, there's no possibility envisioned that one of the disputants talking to the arbitrator, right, might convince the arbitrator, because the assumption is that all of the issues, right, are ones with which the Buddha has dealt adequately, and that the arbitrator is the perfect student of the perfect master. And so there is no possibility that someone might come up with something that should convince the arbitrator, that the arbitrator should actually change his mind about anything. So this can't be done, say, with an arbitrator who doesn't know the entire teaching perfectly, and who isn't able or doesn't feel secure or doesn't act securely in his ability to make all correct practical implications. If the Buddha is doing this in order to set up a regime which will work after his death, then the line that seems to resolve things here in paragraph 17, well, I went to the Blessed One taught me, right, becomes relevant or irrelevant by a lifetime after the Buddha's death, right? Then it becomes impossible for people to say that. And so has he really solved the problems that are going to arise?
Well, I'd first... because the sutta has to be compact, so I think it can't take all the contingencies into account. But in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha says that, after I've passed away, it's the Dhamma and Vinaya, the Dhamma taught by me and the Vinaya laid down or proclaimed by me that should be your teacher after I've passing away. But the plain simple fact is that, even setting up the Dhamma and the Vinaya as the guide didn't settle all the different possibilities, or didn't remove all the possibilities for different ways of preserving the text and the letter, and also for different interpretations. So probably that is why, especially as the Sangha spread to different geographical regions, then the monks in different communities were faced with interpreting maybe the same body of text, but different interpretations arose. And once they came together again, then they found that they were that their interpretations were so different that they actually formed different schools. So that happened. Okay, we'll take one more, then we'll have to stop from
I thought Richard,
Michael,
thank you. I thought Richard's question was particularly relevant in the sense that this sutra appears to me to be about have two major elements. One is the content that's being discussed, but even more important perhaps, at least this is the way I felt it, the structure within which the content is discussed or dealt with or resolved. So I'm thinking... Yes?
No, explain what you mean by... The structure within which.
Well, the structure of how we, whether of being attached to things and our willingness to detach ourselves,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
example, seems to be more relevant. The idea of having a view which may be right or may be wrong,
yeah.
but our ability to detach ourselves from
yeah.
holding on to the view,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
referring to the structure as that,
Yeah.
as being more important than what the view might be. Am I
Yeah.
right in that, or perhaps wrong? But that seems to be more.
I think
the
that's
content.
also, I mean, that's very important, but the Buddha does emphasize that it's important to be right as far as the atta, as far as the meaning goes. Though the vyanjana, the phrasing, the wording differences, he says, are a mere trifling. Okay, we'll have to stop now, and then we could come back for more discussion, say 10 after 12. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Okay, next one, the short way. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya Bhavagupadaya avichihetato etantare satakayupapana rupya rupicha sanya sannino dukha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, next week we won't have the class on Saturday because there is a weekend meditation retreat here, the Anapanasati, mindfulness and breathing retreat. I think if you want to take that retreat, you can still register for it. So we'll have the next class will be 2 weeks, April 17th. Excuse me? Oh, I'm sorry. Time goes very quick. August 17th. And we take Sutta number 104. You can read the whole Sutta. If some of the middle portions seem a bit technical and detailed, don't worry about them. But it's mainly the beginning parts and the parts at the end that are most important. But that deals with the Buddha explaining to the Sangha, again, how to preserve the teaching, to avoid disputes and maintain harmony within the Sangha. Okay, so we end with the 3 bows. Okay, 3 half bows.